His hands stung with blisters, but he kept swinging. The storm was closing in, and he needed walls before dark. A man alone in the wild had two choices: build shelter or freeze. It took a lot of muscle, instinct, focus, and an axe sharp enough to cut through bone, because out there in the wild, a cabin was one of the few things that keeps a man alive. But how did these mountain men do it? How did they turn trees into shelter, fast, strong, and built to last? Well, that's what we're here to find out. My name is Matt Francisco, and this is Wild America. For centuries, people had stacked logs for warmth, safety, and survival. Long before the frontier, however, the log cabin had already proved its worth. Part 1. A History. The log cabin's roots ran deep, back to ancient Europe, where tribes stacked the logs, locking them tight at the corners. The Romans took notice. Vitruvius Pollio even wrote about it, but Scandinavia and Eastern Europe had mastered the craft long before, where winter demanded strong, weatherproof shelter. Logs, notches, no nails. The method spread across northern Europe and into Russia. Then came the colonists. Swedish and Finnish settlers landed in Delaware in 1638 and wasted no time. The forests were full of timber they knew how to use. No sawmills, no blueprints, just an axe, a saw, and the skill to turn trees into walls. Their cabins rose fast, built from sweat and know-how. The Scots, Irish, and British settlers copied the design. A single man could raise a cabin in a couple of months. With several hands, however, a basic cabin could be up in a week, but finishing took much longer. 4 walls, a roof, and a claim staked in the wild. By the 1700s, log cabins were everywhere, simple, solid, and free. Just a matter of chopping, stacking, and working the land. For settlers pushing west, a cabin meant more than shelter. It meant survival, a mark on a land that said, "I belong here." Few stories captured that spirit like Abraham Lincoln's. Born in a rough Kentucky cabin in 1809, he rode that humble image all the way to the White House. And in a nation built on grit, a man from a log cabin was one people trusted. Then came the Homestead Act of 1862, free land for anyone who'd built, farm, and stay. Wagons rolled west. Trees fell. Cabins rose. No fancy houses, no hired hands, just logs, hard work, and the promise of a new start. At first, these cabins were bare bones. 1 room, dirt floor, a single door against the cold, chinks in the walls stuffed with clay, stones, even rags. But times changed. By the mid-1800s, sawmills made log cutting easier in settled areas, but mountain men still hand-hewed their logs, using axes and adzes to smooth and shape them. Yet, in the beginning, a cabin was just a start, a shelter while a man worked the land, nothing more. Some built bigger, but plenty never did. A roof, a fire, and food on the table. And that was enough. The Scotch-Irish style kept it simple. 1 room, 16 by 20 feet, doors front and back, a stone hearth for heat. Pioneers copied the style but stripped it to the bare bones, stacked logs, mud-chinked gaps, a fire burning before nightfall. And as settlements grew, cabins got sturdier. The dog trot style, for instance, split into 2 rooms with a breezeway in the middle, cooling the house in the summer. Then there was the saddlebag next. It consisted of 2 rooms, 2 chimneys, a loft up top, a porch out front. By the mid-1800s, the wealthy man saw the charm. Cabins turned from rough shelters into retreats. The Adirondack style sealed the shift. High-peaked roofs, grand beams, built for comfort, not survival. But for a true frontiersman, a cabin was never about luxury. It was always about holding your ground, braving the wild, and proving you belonged. But history is just the beginning. Out in the wild, a man had to build a cabin. He had no instruction manual or anything. And it all started with an axe, a saw, and the will to survive. Part 2. The big picture. Now, before a man could call any place home, he had to carve it out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. And that started with the log cabin, fast, durable, and built from whatever the land provided. First, the mountain man had to clear the land. hacking down trees, pulling up roots, making space for a cabin. Every log served two purposes: clearing ground and building walls. But not just any tree would do. He needed straight, solid trunks: pine, cedar, fir, or larch. Wood that wouldn't twist, rot, or crack too soon. Fall and winter were best for felling. Spring-cut logs peeled easier, but split bad when they dried. Worse, warm weather, on the other hand, brought insects that chewed wood to dust. Cold season timber, however, held strong. Once cut, logs were stripped of bark, notched at the ends, and stacked tight. If done right, they locked together like a clenched fist, holding strong against wind, rain, and winter's worst. After all, a cabin's main functions were to provide shelter, keep the wolves out, the heat in, and give a man a place to dry his boots and load his rifle by firelight. Often enough, it was nothing fancy: one room, dirt floor, and a single door. But as the land took shape, mountain men could even store food in the cellar and livestock in a pen. That's when the cabin grew: a loft, an extra room, maybe a porch where a man could sit and watch the wind stir through the stumps he'd cut with his own hands. Good logs needed time to dry, peeled and stacked on skids to keep them from rotting. 6 months was ideal, but most mountain men didn't have 6 months. If time was short, they worked with green logs, knowing they would shrink. This meant extra chinking was needed later. Furthermore, mountain men picked the straightest logs they could find. If a curved log had to be used, it was worked into the structure carefully, but the goal was always a tight, level fit. Either way, the better the seasoning, the stronger the cabin. However, in most cases, mountain men chose the straightest logs available and hand-hewed them to fit snugly, and often enough, it's these straightest, cleanest ones that faced the front. The thickest logs went along the bottom to bear the weight. Cabins weren't built wall by wall, they rose evenly, each log laid in turn to keep the weight balanced. Inside dimensions mattered most, outside size changed with log thickness. And if you think building a cabin is tough, try living in one, alone, for 2 years. We covered Henry David Thoreau's fight to survive at Walden Pond in an 11-hour deep dive. That story's waiting for you after this one. In the meantime, keep in mind that a cabin's corners held everything together. The best kind was the round notch, locking each log tight like a handshake. No nails, no pegs, just wood against wood holding tight. However, wooden pegs were sometimes used to help hold the logs in place. And if a man worked alone, walls stopped at 6 feet, or as high as he could lift. With extra hands, the walls were built higher, maybe adding a loft for sleeping. Most cabins ran 12 to 16 feet per side. Small enough to heat, just big enough to live. And once that last log was set, the wilderness became more of a home than just a place to live. As soon as the walls stood and the roof was on, the real work began. You see, gaps between the logs let in wind, rain, and the bitter bite of winter. That's where chinking came in. Mud or clay packed tight into every crack, sealing the warmth inside. It wasn't pretty, but it did the job. Once again, a cabin's strength was its corners. That's where everything locked in, where the walls stood firm against time and weather. A lot of mountain men favored the saddle notch, strong, snug, and designed to shed water, keeping rot at bay. Instead of cutting into both logs, the saddle notch carved only the underside of the top log, letting rain run off instead of pooling. And as the wood dried and shrank, this notch kept gaps tight, holding the cabin together season after season. Now, a skilled hand could carve a saddle notch with nothing but an axe, but the right tools made the job a whole lot smoother: chisels, saws, and so on. Cabin building, nevertheless, started with the foundation logs, 2 running lengthwise, 2 crosswise. Each was squared and hewn flat on the bottom to sit steady. Once placed, they were dogged down to keep from shifting. Then came the first saddle notch. Done right, the logs snuggled together like they'd grown that way, solid, weatherproof, and built to last. Once marked, the upper log was flipped, its underside ready for cutting. A sharp axe chopped out the bulk of the notch, and if the mountain man had a chisel on him, he could smoothen the curve. The goal is a deep enough cut so the log's weight pressed down on its edges, locking it tight. Each log followed the same process. To tighten the fit, a builder could widen the notches slightly, forcing the upper log to squeeze against the lower one as the cabin settled. So, yeah, a good saddle notch made all the difference. Done wrong and the walls twisted and gapped. Done right, they held strong against wind, cold, and time itself. Think of a cabin as a puzzle of weight and balance. The corners kept it standing. But there was also dovetail notches, which looked like a shingled roof shedding rain. Box corners were squared off but durable. Plain tenons relied on weight alone, so each method had its place, but a poor choice meant trouble down the road. Now, once the walls stood, doors and windows had to be framed right. Grooves in the back locked them into place, while the front could be smoothed or rabbeted for a doorstop. And since logs shrank as they dried, a builder left a few extra inches at the corners and openings. Without that gap, doors jammed, windows cracked, and the whole structure loosened wrong. But if done right, that cabin held stable and secure, a fortress against the wilderness. Next, it was time for the floor joists, the backbone of the cabin floor. They fit into notches carved into the bottom logs or rested on a stone foundation if the mountain man had one. Either way, they had to be solid, level, and locked in tight. A man had two ways to set them: notch them into the side logs or flatten a section of the inside wall for support. If he used pole joists, round 4 to 8 inch logs, he'd hew the tops flat so that the floorboards had a stable bed. Every log had to fit snug, no gaps, no wobbles. The corners had to stay level, measured against the floor joists. If a log sat too high, the notch was cut deeper. If one end was thicker, it got flipped to balance. Rough logs were sometimes hewn flat on the underside for a tighter fit, but the goal was always straight, plumb walls. And without modern carpenter's levels, mountain men relied on a plumb bob, a simple weight on a string, or a straight eye-measured board to keep things even. Once the walls were up, they had to be locked in place. This was done using wooden pins or, when available, iron spikes. Wooden pins were often made from tough, seasoned hardwood like oak or hickory, and they were driven through pre-drilled holes, allowing the logs to settle naturally over time. Most cabins were held together with saddle or dovetail notches and wooden pegs. Iron spikes were rarely used by mountain men, for they were found mostly in settlements. Now, early cabins were dark. Windows remained small for security and warmth. Greased paper or oiled cloth was used for windows since glass wasn't available. Some mountain men even used stretch rawhide, but it wasn't really that common. A rough cut made the openings, but final shaping waited until frames were ready, and that way everything fit tight. And as walls rose, those markings stayed in tight, scrawled onto the logs. However, when it came time to cut across a window or door, a man had to be careful. The moment a log split, its loose ends had to be held firm, or the whole wall could move out of line. Also, a mountain man didn't wait to cut doors and windows, he planned them from the start. As he stacked the walls, he marked where the openings would go and notched the logs at the corners. When it was time, he chopped through with a broad axe or adze. If he had a saw, he used it to clean the cut, but most just trusted their swing. To keep the walls from moving, the frames had to be solid, thick timber locked in tight. And since logs shrank over time, he left a small gap above the openings so doors wouldn't jam later. Furthermore, doors and windows needed frames, sturdy, thick timber, to hold the logs steady as the cabin settled. Without them, the walls could crush the openings or twist out of shape. Mountain men, however, didn't waste time with fancy joinery. Openings were framed with rough-hewn timber, secured with pegs or nails if available. Doors were made from split logs, fastened with wooden dowels or rawhide hinges. And to prevent doors and windows from jamming as the logs settled, mountain men left a small gap above each opening, later stuffed with moss, oakum, or wood shavings to block the wind while allowing the cabin to shift naturally. Tightest walls, the best chinking, and the strongest corners wouldn't matter if the roof failed. If it leaked, winter turned the place into a freezing, miserable wreck. A good roof started with what was on hand. If sawn lumber was available in a settlement, it could be used, but most mountain men relied on hand-split shakes, bark, or overlapping logs. He'd cut the top log flat so rafters could sit snug or notching it to hold them in place. Some mountain men built gable ends out of logs, stacking them high for a smooth look. Others framed them with timbers and covered them in shakes or rough planks. Shakes were the frontier standard, split from straight-grained cedar, pine, or whatever wood was handy. If a man had coin, he might trade for sawn shingles, but most split their own. It was back-breaking work, however. Logs were cut into short sections, then split with a froe, a long blade hammered with a wooden maul. Each blow sent a thick, uneven peel shaken off. Unlike thin factory shingles, these had weight, 3/4 of an inch thick, tough as the log walls below. Now, overhangs weren't just for looks. Wide eaves helped keep rain off the walls and let snow slide off instead of piling up. Purlins, strong roof beams, ran across the top logs. Spaced about 2 feet apart, some mountain men doubled them for extra support. Gable logs locked in alongside the roof logs, keeping everything solid. Also, mountain men didn't have steel flash into steel gaps. They relied on tight stacking, overlapping shakes, and, as mentioned earlier, stuffing moss or clay into cracks. If a roof wasn't built right, the first storm would prove it, and out here, a leaky roof could mean freezing to death. A shake roof might show some light from inside, but if laid right, it kept out rain, and out here, metal was rare. Wood laid right held against the storms. Now, most cabins were single room, but some mountain men needed more space, and so, if a man wanted more than one room, he had 2 choices. First, he could stack logs just like the outer walls, locking them tight at the corners, or, if he had boards to spare, he built a frame partition, a lighter wall braced between the logs, but he never conjoined it to the cabin walls. The logs settled over time, and anything attached across them would tear itself apart. Now, in regard to gap filling, some builders in Scandinavia had a different method, chinkless construction, where logs were carefully scribed to fit so tightly that no filler was needed. But frontier survival didn't allow for that kind of fine craftsmanship. A mountain man didn't have weeks to carve out perfect joints. He needed a cabin up before the first snowfall. That's why most cabins relied on saddle notches or simple dovetails, quick, strong, and good enough to hold. Now, a cabin without a fireplace wasn't much of a cabin. Without it, winter crept in fast, and a man could freeze before morning. Fire meant warmth, light, and food. It was the heart of every home. Most frontiersmen built their fireplace first, stacking rough-laid stone at the gable end before raising the walls around it. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and once set, it held strong against time and weather. The hearth was wide and deep, big enough to cook meals and heat the room. The foundation had to go below the frost line, dug deep so shifting ground wouldn't crack the chimney. And as usual, gaps between timber and stone were packed tight with chinking, mud, moss, or clay, sealing out drafts. In the wilderness, there were no fancy heat chambers or metal inserts. Instead, thick stone walls soaked up heat, radiating it long after the fire died down. Some men built double-thick hearths to hold the warmth even longer, and once the fireplace was set and the logs stacked around it, a mountain man might take one last step to protect his work. Outside, he rubbed bear grease or certain animal fat into the wood to fight rain and rot. Some mountain men relied on proper log selection and wide eaves for protection. It wasn't perfect, but out here, nothing was. Simple measures, but they meant the difference between a cabin that stood a few hard seasons and one that lasted a lifetime. Now, a cabin started bare. Just a table, a bed, maybe a stool if time allowed. No clutter, no extras. Everything had a purpose. If a man needed furniture, he built it himself, from the same trees that framed his walls. Lodgepole pine out west, oak or hickory back east, whatever was strong and nearby. First, the bark had to go. If left on, it held moisture and bugs. Once stripped, the wood could be shaped into beds, stools, and tables. Fancy finishes weren't really a concern. As mentioned recently, if a man wanted to protect the wood, he rubbed it down with bear fat or whatever was on hand. Even beeswax, if available. Linseed oil or pine tar works too, but it was uncommon. Rot-resistant logs mattered more. Chairs and stools were simple but built tough. Legs were wedged tight, cross-braced, or pegged with wooden dowels to keep them steady. If a chair fell apart, it wasn't the wood's fault. It meant the builder got it wrong. Benches, too, were rough-cut and strong. Lodgepole pine, birch, or tamarack joined with wooden pegs or notched tight. No glue, no screws, just solid wood locked together. And a bed was as simple as it got. 4 posts, wooden slats, or rope ladders stretched tight. Bunks followed the same rule. Built strong, no wasted effort. A mattress, if a man had one, was stuffed with straw, feathers, or dried grass. And every mountain man needed a place for his gear, a wooden chest for supplies, sometimes a shelf if he had the time. Pine or tamarack worked best, cut and fitted tight with wooden dowels or hand-forged nails. As for firewood, it was stored in simple stacks or wooden bins. Side joints were pegged, not bolted, and if it had a handle, it was carved from wood. On the frontier, every choice had to be practical. A mountain man's first swing of the axe marked the beginning of his home. His last locked him into the land forever.